Mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some attacks on return-oriented programming defenses. But before I do that, I'm going to give a little bit of background on return-oriented programming. So how did we get here? Well, 15 years ago, when you wanted to exploit a memory corruption vulnerability, what you do is you use a code injection attack. And for that, you would just inject some new instructions into the process. You would overwrite some function pointer or return address with a pointer to the beginning of that. And then you would wait for that function pointer to be invoked, and now you would have your instructions running on the target machine. This is prevented with DEP. And what DEP says is that pages in memory are writable or executable, never both. So the stack and the heap should never be executable, so this entirely prevents code injection. But what it leaves open is return-oriented programming. And the idea behind return-oriented programming is you don't actually need to inject any new instructions in order to perform a malicious computation. All you need to do is reorder the existing instructions in some new way to perform a new computation. And return-oriented programming attacks are the only attacks that you see in the wild. Every attack is a return-oriented programming attack because DEP is so widely deployed. So defenders are working on ways to defend against return-oriented programming. So the first way that they're doing this is with ASLR. And ASLR is the widely deployed defense, but it turns out that the first thing that all modern ROP attacks do is bypass it. So we're not going to be talking about that. Another category of defenses is control flow integrity. And other work has looked at the security of this, and so we're also not going to be talking about that very much. A third category of defense is some more modern defenses, on two of which are kBouncer and ROPecker. And these are what we're going to be focusing our attacks on. But first, let me give you a little bit of background on what return-oriented programming is. So the idea behind return-oriented programming is there are lots of instructions in the machine state. It doesn't matter what they do, just there are lots of them there. As an attacker, we're going to pick a couple and say we want to execute those. And notice the last one there is a return, if you can't see it in the back. We're going to say that's a return. If we control the stack, we can pick where it goes next. We want to pick some more instructions to run next, so we pick these. Again, it doesn't really matter what they do, but we're going to pick to run those. And we can repeat this again to go instruction after instruction, chaining together in this way a new piece of instructions that we want to run. I'm going to call a short sequence of instructions a gadget, a little bit of terminology. So what a return-oriented programming attack does is it chains together a bunch of short gadgets, each of which does one useful piece of computation in order to perform some larger computation that consists of a full ROP attack. So, kBouncer. kBouncer is the defense which is meant to prevent return-oriented programming attacks. What kBouncer does is it says maybe if we could inspect the past execution, we could somehow use this to detect if a ROP attack is occurring. So what it looks like is something like this. You have some period of normal execution where you're running your program. And then after some period of time, you issue a system call. Maybe you want to write to a file, you want to read from the file, do something over the network. At that point, kBouncer intercepts the system call and says, let me look at what has been happening recently. And it's going to do this using the last branch record, which is the hardware register on modern Intel CPUs. And it's going to look at the last 16 indirect branches which have executed, which lets it look backwards a little bit and see what's happened. It's going to use this to decide if it looks like what's been executing is a ROP attack or normal execution. In this case, it's normal, so it's going to allow everything to continue. If a ROP attack then starts executing, then what's going to happen next is it's going to eventually have to issue a system call in order to perform anything useful, and kBouncer again gets to run. When kBouncer runs this time, it's again going to look at the last branch record and look at what it sees. This time we'll see a ROP attack, and so it will kill the process. Now, there are two things that kBouncer says that it's going to look at in order to decide whether it's an attack or not. The first thing kBouncer observes is that ROP attacks tend to issue returns to non-call-preceded locations. Okay, so let me work on defining what that means. So imagine again we have some instructions, and I'll walk you through what normal execution looks like. Again, it doesn't matter what the instructions do. I'm just going to trace the program flow a little bit. So we begin executing the top, and we execute all the way down until we hit a call. Okay, we hit a call that means look up where the address goes to, execute some instructions there. So we run these instructions. Now we hit a return. And the return says go back to where the call came from. The return matches with the call and brings you back to the next instruction. So we go back to the test. So I'm going to say that this test is call preceded. The instruction preceding the test is a call. It makes sense for this return to happen. The return has to be able to go back to this test in order for the program to function correctly. If this test were to instead target this add instruction, That would not make sense. The instruction proceeding is not a call. This add is not call preceded. But ROP attacks do exactly this. ROP attacks rely on the fact that with a return, you can go anywhere you want. So what kBouncer is going to say is, as a defense, we will make sure that return instructions target only call preceded addresses. Okay, that's the first thing it does. The second thing it does is kBouncer observes that ROP attacks tend to consist of long sequences of short gadgets. And they're going to define a gadget as a sequence of 20 or fewer instructions ending in a return, and a long sequence of 8 gadgets or more occurring in sequence. And so the idea behind this is that while normal program execution tends to consist of a fair amount of computation and then return, and then a fair amount of computation and then a return, a ROP attack will only issue 1 or 2 instructions and then a return, and then 1 or 2 instructions and then a return. So they prevent ROP attacks in a second way by saying we're not going to allow long sequences of short gadgets. All right, so how does it look like? Well, you're going to have some period of a ROP attack. It will then issue a system call. kBouncer gets to look at the recent history by looking at the last branch record, and will then check, is everything call preceded? It will then make sure there's no long chain. As long as everything's good, it will allow it to continue. In this case, it's not. There's a ROP attack. ROP attacks are not call preceded, so it will detect it on that account. But it will also detect the fact that there's a long chain of gadgets, and for both reasons, will terminate the process. And it's important to note that kBouncer is a really exciting defense. kBouncer has basically no overhead. kBouncer can be deployed on existing hardware and can improve binaries transparently without them being aware that it's even running. So kBouncer is a very nice defense, but the important question is, does it work? Does kBouncer raise the bar for attackers? And in this talk, I'm going to argue that it does not, that it's possible to create attacks that bypass kBouncer. So the first attack I'm going to present to you is one called history flushing. And so the goal of the history flushing attack, and the goal of all of our attacks, is just going to be issue a single system call. Once we've done that, we're done. We can exec a new process. kBouncer is not going to be running there. We're done. And to do this, I'm going to use something which I'm going to call a large NOP gadget. This is going to be a gadget with 3 properties. First, it's going to be call preceded. Second, it's going to be long. It's going to be more than 20 instructions. In particular, this is longer than the defense threshold. And finally, it's going to be an effective NOP. It's basically going to do nothing. At right is an example of one that we use in our attacks. It doesn't really matter what it does, but it's just an example. And the important thing to know is they're easy to find. In almost all programs, you can find something like this. So how do we use it? Well, what we're going to do is we're just going to drop the original exploit. No modifications. We just put the exploit there. And now, before we issue the system call, we're going to do something that I'll call history flushing. And that's going to work by inserting this large NOP gadget. And then I'll insert it again and again, and we'll keep doing this for a large number of times. And I'll just abbreviate this as history flushing. Then we issue the system call. So now the important question is, what does kBouncer get to see here? Well, what kBouncer gets to see is only the history flushing and then issuing the system call. Because we've inserted so many of these large NOP gadgets, the LBR has become full of these large NOP gadgets, and so there is nothing that it can see in the traditional ROP attack. So even though the traditional ROP attack is still not call preceded and still a long sequence of gadgets, kBouncer can't see that. The only thing kBouncer gets to see is the history flushing and issuing the system call. And as long as we do that in a call preceded manner, kBouncer is going to allow the attack to continue. Okay, so this breaks kBouncer. And more than that, it really breaks any limited history defense. Anything that relies only on a limited amount of history can be broken in this way. But the question here is, can we fix it? Is there something little we can do to make kBouncer a lot stronger? Also, the obvious defense is going to say, okay, I'll give you an LBR with an infinite number of entries, so you can no longer flush the history. Another way of looking at this is you can say, okay, kBouncer runs continuously. At every point in time, kBouncer is running. And this is the view I'll take. They're identical, but I will take this one. So while normal kBouncer would only be able to look at the last little bit of execution, the improved kBouncer could look at the middle or even the beginning. At all times, this improved kBouncer is running. And so this stops the history flushing attack. And the reason why it stops it is that when we mount the traditional ROP attack, kBouncer will stop the process right then. You can't actually get to the point where you can issue the system call even. So the question then is, does this work? Does this improved kBouncer somehow stop the attacks that we discussed previously? Well, yes, it does. But we can develop new attacks and extend our previous ones slightly in order to break this improved version of kBouncer. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing you have to know is that the call-preceded detector is insufficient. The call-preceded defector that kBouncer picked was the one that said if non-call-preceded gadgets, we will kill the process right away. And kBouncer really wants to believe that this is the case, that ROP attacks need to be able to mount attacks and can only do so in a non-call-preceded manner. And we managed to show that call-preceded ROP attacks are possible. We took 10 binaries from user bin with 20,000 instructions, and in all of them there were sufficient gadgets to mount a fully call-preceded return-oriented programming attack. And for comparison, that's about the size of user bin diff. So anything larger than that, there are plenty of gadgets to mount a full ROP attack. Okay, so how does this improved attack work? Well, we can't just say, let's just put a call-preceded ROP attack and be done. You would want this to be the case, but everything's going to be call-preceded, so we're good on that account. But there still is a long chain of gadgets. It's still going to be the case that there are a long chain of short gadgets which kBouncer is going to use to detect that this is an attack. So what we're going to do is we're going to reuse this long NOP gadget we introduced earlier. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to take this exploit that we have, the call-preceded exploit, and we're going to split it into little pieces. And for in between each piece, we're now going to insert this NOP gadget. And now what this is going to do is when kBouncer looks at an arbitrary point in time, it's going to see a couple of short gadgets and then a long gadget, so long that kBouncer won't think it's a gadget. And then it'll see a couple more short gadgets. And so even though it can see everything, this is less than the length threshold that kBouncer uses to detect an attack. So it's going to say, okay, this looks like normal execution to me because this gadget is not classified as a gadget to kBouncer. So even with unlimited history, ROP attacks are still possible. So ROPecker is something that I haven't really defined yet, but it's another defense that was announced at NDSS earlier this year. And it's basically the same thing as this improved kBouncer, which I just mentioned to you. There are some ways in which it's different, but those differences only let you mount more powerful attacks. You can think of this as also a complete break on ROPecker. You can see our paper for more details on how we can improve our attacks to especially break ROPecker. So what results do we have? Well, kBouncer showed that it was effective at preventing 6 real-world exploits. So what we did is we took 4 of those, and we modified the exploits to be stealthier versions of the exploit, which would work even if in the presence of kBouncer. And the 2 which we didn't modify were basically because we couldn't run the exploit in the first place. It was not hard to make these modifications. It took us about an afternoon. It's not a significant hindrance to actual exploit developers. So stepping back a little bit, ours isn't the only work in this field. At Oakland earlier this year, there was a paper which showed that CFI is weaker than we thought, and it does this by introducing call-preceded return-oriented programming. Our work largely confirms that what they have shown, that call-preceded return-oriented programming is easy, and we do more with breaking these other defenses. But there are 2 other pieces of related work that you'll hear about soon, which are going to be the talks which will follow mine. And both of these, we all happened to independently and concurrently discover very similar attacks on ROPecker, kBouncer, and other defenses. And you will hear more about the details for theirs, and I encourage you to stay and listen to their attacks on those defenses. So what does this mean for defenses, though? I mean, so clearly it means that kBouncer, ROPecker, and some other things are broken. But what does it mean for new defenses? Well, the first thing is it means that defenses really can't rely on a limited amount of history. I think that it's the case that any defense which uses only a limited amount of history is probably going to be able to be broken by a very similar attack. Once you've given complete control of the machine over to the attacker and said, I will only inspect at the very end, there's probably always going to be something they can do to hide the fact that they had control of the machine. The second thing this means, our work means, is that call-preceded ROP is possible and is very easy. So CFI defenses and other defenses which use call-preceded ROP as a detection mechanism are probably not going to work. They're going to need something else. In particular, this probably means CFI needs to return to its roots. The original CFI, which had the shadow stack and everything else, works well. But all of these like CFI light schemes, which try to do CFI in a faster manner, have been broken by these sorts of attacks. So CFI really probably needs shadow stacks or something else that's clever that someone can think of to prevent attacks. The final implication is that defenses like kBouncer, which try and classify code as either useful for gadget and useful for not for gadgets, is very hard. kBouncer likes to say that gadgets are things which are shorter than 20 instructions, and non-gadgets are things longer than 20 instructions. But we can, as an attacker, find things which are otherwise longer than 20 instructions, which would be otherwise useless, and use them for the sole purpose of tricking kBouncer into believing that there is no attack. So doing this is hard, and it might not even be possible to do. And that leaves me with one final thought, which is that defenses really need to focus on fundamental differences between normal execution and ROP attacks. And it's not immediately obvious what these fundamental differences are, but once we have a good understanding of what these fundamental differences are, we can leverage those to create fully sound defenses for return-oriented programming. Thank you for listening. I'll now take any questions.
Okay, we've got time for questions. Please come to the microphone in the center aisle and state your name and affiliation.
Everyone is scared.
I can ask one question. So it looked like the examples in your paper used both 32-bit and 64-bit instructions. I was wondering if you could comment on which or both of those you used in your experiments and whether you saw any differences between them.
Yeah, it's possible in both cases, in 32 and 64-bit. We mounted two of the exploits which we modified were 32-bit exploits, and 2 of them were 64-bit. There was no significant difference in terms of how we exploited them. The only difference was in the complexity of the original exploits. So some of the 64-bit exploits were sometimes just a little more complicated due to some of the difficulties in 64-bit defenses, but for all basic purposes, it was the same.
Thanks. Any other questions? Okay, let's thank Nicholas again.